One life changed eternity. Welcome to Justice and Glory. Together.
It is one of the strangest moments in the Gospels. On a spring morning outside Jerusalem, in the final week of his life, Jesus is hungry. He sees a fig tree in the distance, covered in leaves, and walks over hoping to find something to eat. He finds nothing but leaves, and then he does something that has puzzled readers for 2,000 years. He curses the tree so that it withers and dies. What makes the moment so troubling is a single line the Gospel of Mark adds, almost as an aside. It was not the season for figs. Jesus appears to condemn a tree for failing to produce the one thing the calendar had not yet allowed it to produce. Critics have pointed to this scene as proof of a bad temper. Believers have wrestled with it for centuries. But what if the tree was never really the point? What if this was the most carefully aimed act of his final week, and almost everyone has been reading it too literally? The road from Bethany. Passover week. To understand what happened on that road, you have to know when it happened. This was not an ordinary week. It was Passover, the holiest season in the Jewish calendar, when Jerusalem swelled with pilgrims from across the ancient world. Only the day before, according to the Gospels, Jesus had ridden into the city on a donkey, while crowds spread their cloaks and waved branches, hailing him as a king. The tension in Jerusalem was already dangerous. The religious authorities were watching him. The Roman garrison had been reinforced for the festival, and Jesus was spending his nights in the village of Bethany, on the far side of the Mount of Olives, walking into the city each morning. It was on one of these morning walks, Mark tells us, that he grew hungry and saw the fig tree. There is a detail in the way the story is told that is easy to miss. The curse and its visible result are separated by a full day. On the first morning, he confronted the tree. That same day, he confronted the temple. On the second morning, the tree lay dead. The three events are bound together in time as tightly as they are bound in meaning. In the middle of the most charged days he would ever live, he stops to deal with a tree. The question is why? A tree in full leaf. Here is the first detail almost everyone misses, and it turns on how fig trees actually grow. The fig tree of the region does not produce its fruit and its leaves in the ordinary order you might expect. Before or along with its leaves, it puts out a crop of small early figs, tiny green knobs that appear on the branches as the foliage opens. In Hebrew, these early figs are called pagim, and the ancient love poem of the Song of Songs mentions them. The fig tree, putting forth its green figs as spring arrives. These early figs are edible, and more importantly, they are a promise. Their presence means the tree is alive and working, and that a full crop will follow later in the summer. Their absence means something is wrong. Figs were one of the staple foods of the region, dried and pressed into cakes, eaten fresh in season, exactly the thing a traveler might hope to find by the roadside. And a fig tree, covered in leaves, is advertising that it has fruit. So when Jesus saw a tree in full leaf from a distance, the leaves themselves were a claim. They said, "Come and eat." And when he arrived, there was nothing, not even the early figs that the leaves had promised. This is why many scholars and commentators argue that Mark's puzzling line, "It was not the season for figs," is not the contradiction it first appears to be. The main harvest was indeed months away, but a leafy tree with no early fruit at all was not a tree waiting for its season. It was a tree that would bear nothing that year. It was all show. Leaves without figs, the appearance of life without the substance. The fig tree in the prophets. To the people who first heard this story, the image of a barren fig tree carried a meaning that is almost invisible to modern readers. In the Hebrew scriptures, the fig tree was one of the standard symbols for the nation of Israel and its spiritual condition. Again and again, the prophets used it. Through the prophet Jeremiah, God had said that when he came looking for fruit among his people, he found none on the vine and none on the fig tree, and even the leaves were withered. The same prophet had been shown a vision of 2 baskets of figs set before the temple. One basket of good figs and one of figs so rotten they could not be eaten. A picture of a whole nation being sorted and judged. The prophet Hosea compared Israel in her early days to the first ripe figs on a fig tree, a delight quickly lost. The prophet Micah lamented that he searched for a first ripe fig and found nothing to eat. A picture of a society empty of faithfulness. The prophet Joel described the fig tree stripped bare and the branches turned white as a sign of coming judgment. And in one of the most famous passages of all, Isaiah sang a song about a vineyard, lovingly planted and tended, that produced only bad fruit until its owner tore down its walls and let it go to ruin. The vineyard, Isaiah said plainly, was the house of Israel. For anyone raised on these texts, a fruit tree that looked alive but produced nothing was never just about horticulture. It was a mirror held up to a people who had the outward forms of faith, but had stopped producing what those forms were meant to yield. Justice, mercy, faithfulness, real fruit. 3 years and 1 more. There is a reason a fig tree, and not some other tree, became the vehicle for such a message, and it reaches back into Jesus' own teaching. Earlier in his ministry, according to the Gospel of Luke, Jesus had told a parable about exactly this. A man had planted a fig tree in his vineyard, and for 3 years he came looking for fruit on it, and found none. "Cut it down," he told his gardener. "Why should it waste the soil?" But the gardener pleaded for patience. "Leave it 1 more year," he said. "Let me dig around it and fertilize it, and if it bears fruit next year, well and good. If not, then you can cut it down." That parable is about mercy that is running out. It is about a God who comes again and again looking for fruit, and who waits and digs and fertilizes and extends the deadline, but who will not wait forever. When Jesus stood before the leafy, fruitless tree in his final week, that earlier parable hung in the air behind it. The season of patient waiting, the enacted sign seemed to say, was reaching its end. The 1 more year had come and it had gone. The story with a story inside it. Now the second detail, and this one is a piece of deliberate craftsmanship. If you read the account in the Gospel of Mark carefully, you notice something odd about how it is told. Jesus curses the fig tree in the morning, but the tree does not visibly wither until the following morning, a full day later. And in between those 2 moments, Mark inserts an entirely different scene. He tells the story of Jesus entering the temple and driving out the money changers and the merchants, overturning their tables and declaring that the house of God had been turned into a den of robbers. Then, and only then, does Mark return to the fig tree, now withered from the roots. Scholars have a name for this technique. They call it a Markan sandwich or intercalation, and Mark uses it throughout his gospel. He splits one story in half and places another story inside it, because the two are meant to be read as commentary on each other. The barren fig tree is not a random event that happened to fall near the temple cleansing. Mark has wrapped the one around the other on purpose. The tree with leaves and no fruit is the temple, a place full of religious activity, crowded, busy, impressive to look at, and yet failing to produce the one thing it existed to produce. When Jesus cleansed the temple, he quoted the prophet Isaiah, that God's house was meant to be a house of prayer for all nations. Instead, it had become a marketplace. Leaves, but no figs. Bethphage, the house of unripe figs. The geography of that week adds a strange and almost poetic layer. The village from which Jesus began his ride into Jerusalem, mentioned by name in the Gospels, was called Bethphage. The name is Hebrew, and it means, quite literally, the house of unripe figs. Jesus began the final act of his public life in a place named for figs that had not yet ripened, and within days he stood before a fig tree that never would. Whether the Gospel writers intended the echo or simply recorded it, the resonance is hard to miss. As for the temple itself, archaeology has helped us picture exactly what Jesus confronted. Herod the Great had rebuilt the temple on a colossal scale, its outer courts covering an area larger than many entire ancient cities. The outermost court was known as the Court of the Gentiles, the one space in the whole complex where non-Jews, the nations of Isaiah's prophecy, were permitted to come and pray. A stone barrier separated it from the inner courts, and archaeologists have recovered the actual warning inscriptions that once stood on that barrier, carved in Greek, threatening death to any foreigner who passed beyond it. And it was precisely this outer court, the court of the nations, that had filled with the noise of commerce. The traders were not there by accident. Every worshiper owed a temple tax that had to be paid in a particular coinage, so money changers set up their tables to exchange the ordinary coins of the empire for the required temple currency, taking a fee. Merchants sold the animals and the doves that pilgrims needed for their offerings. Over time, this necessary trade had swelled until it crowded out the one court that was supposed to belong to the nations. The building was magnificent. Its leaves were spectacular, but at its heart, Jesus was saying, the fruit was gone, kairos, the appointed time. The original language holds one more clue. When Mark writes that it was not the season for figs, the Greek word he uses for season is kairos. Kairos does not simply mean a slot on the calendar. The Greeks had another word for ordinary clock and calendar time. Kairos means the appointed time, the right moment, the decisive hour. And in the Gospels, kairos is loaded. It is the word used when Jesus announces that the time is fulfilled and the kingdom of God has come near. So when the text says it was not the kairos of figs, some readers hear a deliberate irony running beneath the sentence. The tree was being confronted, not at its natural harvest, but at the appointed moment of a far greater visitation. And there is a haunting parallel. In the Gospel of Luke, as Jesus wept over Jerusalem that same week, he told the city that ruin was coming because it had not recognized the kairos, the appointed time of its visitation. The very same word. A moment of visitation that the city, like the tree, had failed to meet. The description of what happened to the tree carries the same weight. Mark does not say it merely wilted. He says it had withered from the roots, from the very source of its life, total and irreversible. The Gospel of Matthew, telling the same story more briefly, says the tree withered at once, immediately, the moment the words were spoken. This was not a slow decline. It was a verdict pronounced and a verdict carried out. And yet the words Jesus spoke were not the shout of a frustrated man. May no one ever eat fruit from you again. It is the calm, terrible cadence of a prophet delivering a sentence. The objection. None of this means the scene is easy, and honesty requires that we take the hardest reading seriously. The 20th century philosopher Bertrand Russell, in a famous essay explaining why he was not a Christian, pointed to this very episode as evidence that Jesus could be unreasonable and ill-tempered, cursing a tree for not bearing fruit out of season. It is a fair objection if the story is read flatly, as a man losing patience with a plant. Some scholars have also questioned whether the event happened as described, suggesting that it may have grown out of the parable Jesus told, recorded in the Gospel of Luke, about a fruitless fig tree that a gardener begs to spare. Others have read the whole episode as primarily a lesson about faith, because that is the direction Jesus himself takes it. When the disciples marvel at the withered tree, he does not explain the symbolism. He tells them that with faith, they could say to a mountain, "Be lifted up and thrown into the sea," and it would happen. Some scholars note that he may have been gesturing as he said this at the Temple Mount rising in front of them, tying the lesson on faith directly back to the judgment on the temple. The Gospels, in other words, hold more than one meaning and tension here, and they do not force a single reading. But the deepest layer, the one the first audience would have felt in their bones, was the oldest one. the withered roots. Picture the disciples the next morning, walking the same road back toward the city. Peter is the one who notices. The tree they had passed the day before, green and full, is now brown and dead, withered from the roots up. And in that image, the meaning that had been gathering finally lands. Jesus had not lost his temper with a tree. He had performed the last acted parable of his ministry. The Hebrew prophets before him had done the same kind of thing for centuries. Jeremiah smashed a clay jar in front of the elders to show that God would break a rebellious nation beyond repair. Ezekiel lay bound on his side for days as a living sign against the doomed city. Isaiah walked stripped and barefoot for 3 years as a warning to nations that trusted in the wrong protector. A prophet's message was not always spoken. Sometimes it was performed so that people could not forget it. And here, in the last days before his death, Jesus stood before a tree that looked alive and was not, and he let it become a picture of everything he had come to confront. A religion of leaves, a temple of impressive foliage and vanished fruit, a people who had the appearance of devotion without its substance. The curse on the tree was not cruelty. It was grief made visible. It was the sorrow of one who came looking for fruit among his own and found only leaves, what the tree foretold. There's a final, sobering historical footnote. Within that same week, according to the Gospels, Jesus looked at the magnificent temple and told his stunned disciples that not one of its great stones would be left standing on another. It sounded impossible. The temple was one of the wonders of the ancient world. Yet roughly 40 years later, in the year 70, a Jewish revolt against Rome ended in catastrophe. The Roman army besieged Jerusalem, broke through its walls, and burned the temple to the ground. The Jewish historian Josephus, who lived through the war and watched it unfold, described the destruction in harrowing detail, the courts running with fire, the great sanctuary reduced to smoking ruin. The building, whose foliage had once been so spectacular, was within a single generation as withered as the tree on the road. Whatever one believes about how Jesus knew, the historical fact stands. The temple he confronted did not survive the century. Leaves without fruit. And that is why this small, strange story has never let readers go. Strip away the distance of 2,000 years, and the question it asks is uncomfortably direct. It is not really a question about a tree or even about an ancient temple. It is a question about the gap between what we appear to be and what we actually produce. The fig tree was condemned, not for being barren in an honest, leafless winter when no one expected anything of it. It was condemned for wearing the full dress of fruitfulness while offering nothing underneath. The danger the story warns against is not failure, it is pretense. The outward show of life without its substance. For an institution, that can mean grandeur without justice, ritual without mercy, a crowded court and an empty purpose. For a person, it can mean the language and the habits of goodness with nothing living behind them. The tree made a promise with its leaves that it could not keep. And the sharpest edge of the story is that Jesus took that promise seriously. He walked across a field expecting to be fed by something that claimed to have fruit. That expectation and the disappointment that followed is the whole point. He still comes looking. The fig tree withered on a road outside Jerusalem in the last week of a life that was itself about to be cut down and, according to those who followed him, to rise again. It is easy to read the moment as a puzzle, a hungry man and an unlucky tree. But the people who first told the story understood that the tree was a mirror, and that the man standing before it was asking a question that outlives every empire and every temple. Not whether we have leaves, everyone has leaves, but whether, when someone comes hungry and hopeful and looks closely at our lives, they find anything real to eat. In our next story, we will step inside the temple. Jesus confronted that same week and ask what he truly meant when he called it a den of robbers and why those few words nearly cost him his life on the spot.